I didn't think anything was wrong with her at the beginning. If anything, it felt like the opposite, like I had finally met someone who understood me without me having to explain everything. She listened in a way that made me feel seen, not just heard, like she noticed things other people usually missed, and the way she talked about relationships made it sound simple, like it wasn't supposed to be complicated if it was real. She'd say things like, "It's just two people choosing each other fully." And at the time, that sounded right to me. Maybe even better than anything I had before, because there was no confusion, no mixed signals, no distance, just this clear feeling that she was all in. We got close fast, faster than I expected, but it didn't feel rushed, it felt natural, like we skipped the awkward stage and went straight into something deeper. And the more time we spent together, the more it felt like everything outside of us mattered less. Not because she told me that directly, but because of how she framed things, like the world outside was noisy, distracting, full of people who don't really understand you. And what we had was something separate from all that, something quieter, more real. At first, I liked that feeling. It made everything simpler, like I didn't have to divide my attention or explain myself to different people anymore. I could just be with her, and that was enough. And I didn't question it because nothing about it felt forced. It felt like I was choosing it too. Looking back now, I think that's what made it so easy. It didn't feel like something was being taken away. It felt like something better was replacing it at some point. She brought up social media in a way that didn't feel serious at first, just a casual comment about how people keep too many connections that don't really mean anything, how most of it is just noise, and I agreed because it sounded true. And then she said something like, "What if we just kept what actually matters?" And it didn't feel like a request, more like an idea we were both arriving at together. So when she suggested I clean up my following, it felt logical, not controlling, just simplifying things. I started with random accounts, people I didn't really talk to, old connections that didn't mean anything anymore. And it actually felt good at first, like I was getting rid of something unnecessary, like things were becoming more focused, more intentional. And she noticed it, said it made her feel closer to me, like I was choosing us over everything else. And that made it feel right, like I was doing something good for the relationship, not losing anything important. Then it slowly shifted, not all at once, just step by step. She started pointing out specific people, asking why I still followed them, not accusing, just questioning in a way that made me think twice, and I didn't have strong answers, so I removed them too, because in the moment it didn't feel like a big deal, just another small adjustment, another way to make things cleaner, better. And the strange part was, I didn't feel like I was being pushed, it felt like I was agreeing every time, like I was the one deciding it. Even though looking back now, I don't remember where my decisions ended and her influence started. It didn't stop there. It just kept moving, slowly enough that I didn't question where it was going. She'd bring it up in small ways, not as a demand, more like a thought, like, "Do you really need all those people around you? Or don't you feel better when it's just us?" And every time it sounded reasonable, even comforting, like she was helping me focus on what actually mattered. And I agreed without really thinking about what I was giving up in the process. Then it shifted to people I actually knew, friends I talked to, people I had history with. And that's when I hesitated for the first time, not because I didn't trust her, but because it felt like crossing into something more real, something that would actually change my life outside of the relationship. But she noticed it immediately, the hesitation, and she didn't get angry. She didn't push. She just went quiet for a moment and said something like, "I don't want to compete for your attention." And that line stayed with me longer than anything else, because it made it feel like the problem wasn't her asking, it was me not giving enough. So I did it, one by one. Conversations got shorter, messages went unanswered, and eventually I just removed them completely. And every time I did it, she got warmer, closer, like I was doing something right, like I was proving something without needing to say it out loud. And I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment things started changing outside of me, not just inside my head. It kept going in the same quiet way, nothing dramatic, nothing that felt like a clear turning point, just small shifts that slowly became normal. She would notice things before I even mentioned them, ask why I still talked to certain people, why I needed those conversations at all. And every time it sounded less like a question and more like something I should already agree with, like I was the one holding on to things that didn't matter anymore. And I started to believe that too. because from inside the relationship it felt like everything else was just background noise. Unnecessary, distracting, something that took me away from what we had. I talked less, replied less, stopped reaching out first, and eventually those connections just faded on their own. And the strange part was how natural it all felt while it was happening, like I was choosing to simplify my life, not realizing how much smaller it was becoming. She would say things like, "See how calm it is now," or "It's better when it's just us." And I agreed, because in that moment it really did feel calmer, quieter, easier to exist without all the other voices. And I didn't question why that calm only existed when everything else was gone. And somewhere in that process, without noticing exactly when, I stopped being someone who had people around him and became someone whose world was centered completely around one person. It didn't feel like a loss at first. It felt like focus, like everything was finally clear, just one person, one connection, no distractions, and that made it easier to justify every step I had already taken. Because from the inside it didn't look like isolation, it looked like commitment, like I was choosing something real over everything else that didn't matter. She kept reinforcing it in small ways, saying things like, "You don't need all those people when you have me," or "No one understands you the way I do." And I didn't argue with that, because by that point it felt true, not because it actually was, but because everything else had slowly been removed, and there was nothing left to compare it to. Then it shifted again, not suddenly, just enough to feel different. She started asking about my family, not in a warm or curious way, but in a way that felt measured, like she was trying to understand where they stood in my life, how often I talked to them, what they knew about me. And at first I didn't think much of it. I answered normally, but I noticed how her tone changed slightly when I mentioned them, not negative, just less open, like they didn't fit into the picture she was building. And that's when she said it, calmly, like it wasn't something extreme at all. "Don't you think even family can sometimes hold you back?" And I remember pausing, not because I agreed, but because I didn't expect that line to be crossed so easily. And for the first time, something inside me didn't align with her immediately, but I didn't push back either. I just stayed quiet, and that silence was enough for her to keep going. She didn't push right away. She just let that idea sit there, like it would grow on its own. And in a way it did, because after that I started noticing how she reacted every time I mentioned my family, the small pauses, the slight change in her expression, like those conversations didn't belong in the space we had created, and it wasn't something she said directly. It was more how she made it feel, like talking to them was stepping outside of what we had. Then she started framing it differently, not as something I had to do, but as something that would be better for me, saying things like, "You're different when it's just us," or "I feel like I lose you when you go back to them." And that made it harder to ignore, because now it wasn't about them being a problem. It was about me choosing between two versions of myself, one where everything was simple and focused on her, and one where there were still other people, other connections, other influences. And without really deciding, I started pulling back again, replying less, calling less, keeping conversations shorter, telling myself it was temporary, that nothing important was changing, but something was, even if I didn't fully see it yet, because every step I took away from them made it easier to stay closer to her. And at some point, it stopped feeling like a balance and started feeling like a direction I was already moving in. It didn't feel like a clear decision, more like something that kept happening on its own, one small step at a time until there wasn't much left to question. Calls turned into short messages, messages turned into nothing, and every time I chose not to reach out it felt easier than the last time, like I was already getting used to a version of my life where they weren't part of it. She never told me directly to cut them off, not in a way you could call out. She just kept shaping how it felt, saying things like, "We don't need anyone else," or "This is enough, isn't it?" And in the moment it felt like a question, but it didn't really leave space for a different answer. I remember one moment clearly. I was about to call my mom, just out of habit, nothing serious, and she looked at me and said quietly, "Why do you need that right now?" Not aggressively, not accusing, just calmly, and I stopped. Not because I didn't have a reason, but because for a second I couldn't explain it in a way that didn't make it sound unnecessary. And that's what changed something in me, because it wasn't about whether I should call or not. It was about how easily I let that moment pass, how quickly something normal started to feel like something I had to justify. And instead of questioning that, I just put the phone down and stayed where I was, And in that moment, I didn't realize it. But I had already started choosing her version of reality over my own. After that, it didn't feel like I was deciding anything anymore. It just felt like things were already decided. I stopped reaching out completely, not because I didn't want to, but because it felt unnecessary every time the thought came up, like I would have to explain it, justify it, and it was easier not to. My phone got quieter, messages stopped coming in, calls disappeared, and at first it felt calm, like she said it would, like everything was finally simple. She noticed it too, said things like, "See, this is better," and I agreed, because from the inside it really did feel easier. There was nothing pulling me in different directions anymore. But after a while, that calm started to feel different, not peaceful, just empty in a way I couldn't explain. And that's when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just that I chose her. It was that there was no one else left to choose at all. It didn't hit me all at once. It came in small moments, like when I opened my contacts and realized there was no one I could call without thinking twice, or when I wanted to share something and didn't even know who that someone used to be anymore. And that's when that quiet feeling turned into something heavier, because it wasn't just that I had less people, it was that I had stopped being someone who had people at all. Everything started revolving around her completely, not just my time, but my thoughts, my decisions, even the way I saw things. And the strangest part was how normal it felt from the inside, like I had adjusted without noticing it happening. She would say things like, "This is how it should be." And I didn't argue, because I didn't have anything to compare it to anymore. There was no outside voice, no other perspective, just hers, and mine slowly becoming the same. And that's when I realized something that didn't sit right, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly in the background. I didn't just lose contact with people. I lost the part of myself that existed around them too. And that's when something finally shifted, not because she changed, but because I started noticing what was missing instead of what was there. The silence didn't feel calm anymore. It felt controlled, like everything around me had been reduced to one version of reality that I didn't question until there was nothing else left to compare it to. I remember picking up my phone one night, not to message anyone, just out of habit, scrolling through empty chats, realizing there was no one I could reach out to without it feeling strange. And that moment stayed longer than anything else, not dramatic, just clear. Because for the first time, it didn't feel like I had chosen this. It felt like I had been slowly moved into it. I looked at her differently after that, not with anger, not even with fear yet, just with this quiet awareness that something about all of this wasn't as natural as it had felt in the beginning. And the more I thought about it, the more one thing kept coming back. I didn't just get closer to her. I got further from everything else at the same time, and I never noticed where that line was crossed. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't even know how to put it into words without it sounding unreal. So I just sat with it, letting that realization settle in slowly. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Nothing about this happened suddenly. There was no single moment where everything changed. It was built piece by piece, choice by choice, until there were no other choices left to make. I looked around my life and realized how small it had become, not because something was taken by force, but because I had let it shrink without noticing. And that was the part that stayed with me the most, not what she asked, not even what I agreed to, but how natural it all felt while it was happening. When I finally looked at her, really looked, I didn't see someone who forced me into anything. I saw someone who shaped everything around me so slowly that I didn't feel it changing, and that was worse. I didn't yell, didn't argue. I just understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't choosing her over everyone else. I had already lost everyone else before I realized I had a choice. And standing there, with nothing left outside of what we had, I understood something that didn't feel dramatic, just final. I wasn't just alone. I had been made alone, step by step, without ever seeing it happen.